Why yes, all of the flags did come on our ship.
Whoa!
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, what flags do you ship? Personally, Italy and Ireland. They just look like they'd get along. But today is about flagships, and in Monster Hunter, generally speaking, but not always, a flagship monster is the specific beastie chosen to don the cover art for each Monster Hunter game. In some cases, there are multiple different versions of the game's art, such as with different localizations, leading to multiple flagships for the same game, and in other cases, the developers themselves have stated that they view multiple different monsters as sharing the flagship status. And so there isn't exactly quite one per game, but these are more or less intended to be the iconic creatures that you think about most when you remember the game in question. The monster that most sticks with your brain, defines the hunting style of that game, and importantly, as it was on the cover art for the game itself, this is the monster that was chosen to try and sell the new game, to entice people to pick it up. And of course, back in the day when most game purchases were physical, this was a massive part of drawing in new players to check out Monster Hunter as a series. So as someone who has played every mainline Monster Hunter game and a few outside of that too, and with the context of Monster Hunter Wilds now nicely settled in, I thought it would be a good time to revisit my thoughts on the flagship monsters in the series, of course in tier list format. Going in chronological order, let's start with Rathalos, the flagship of Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter Freedom, who I have in the B tier. As a flagship, he is iconic. I think he's a relatively tame monster by modern standards for sure, but this is the monster that flagships the entire series, honestly, not even just the first game, and in that sense, there's no way he could ever be lower than a B tier, even if I personally think that pretty much every one of these monsters is better than him as a pure monster, and that again is just my opinion. Second up is Azure Rathalos, who's in the D tier, the flagship of Monster Hunter G. This was one of the first examples of a subspecies monster, and to me the original subspecies were all a bit sort of meh in general, mostly just being color swaps with some very minor moveset changes, and this eventually of course led to super creative reimaginings of subspecies like Coral Pookie Pookie, who is nothing like regular Pookie Pookie, so I love modern subspecies, but the older subspecies not so much. Azure Rathalos is the rare case where I think the changes that were made to him from base Rathalos make him a worse monster, a less enjoyable monster to play against. He flies more, he has longer flying attack combos, and nobody likes fighting against a monster that they can't even reach. Also, I have a personal grudge held against him for that one time in Monster Hunter World where I failed an arena quest against him, which, yes, does mean that I carded 9 times in the one quest. There is a reason that I'm the noob in Pro and Noob. After that, we have Kushala in the B tier, who is the flagship of Monster Hunter Dose. I think as a monster, my opinion of him went up a lot after his fight was reworked in Monster Hunter Rise, but I think as a flagship, he's just sort of alright. He doesn't instantly make me think of the second generation games, and honestly, most of my thoughts when it comes to Kushala are his Monster Hunter World fight, which are not great thoughts, and it's not even the game that he is the flagship of. So while I would say as a monster, I think he has improved over the years, the position that he keeps in my head isn't very flagshipy, so for this list, he gets to sit in the B tier. Next up is Tigrex, also in the B tier, the flagship of Monster Hunter Freedom 2. I like Tigrex, I think he's a solid monster, and I think he's a great example of Monster Hunter creature design to have on your game cover. That perfect mix of dinosaur, but also fantasy mythological funkiness that makes Monster Hunter exactly what it is, which is to say that I think his role as a flagship is quite fitting and solid. I simply think that the monsters in higher tiers are either ones that I enjoy more on a personal level, or that I think fit the concept of a flagship even better than he does. Next up, Nargacuga, also in the B tier, and this was the flagship of Monster Hunter Freedom Unite. Again, this is a perfect monster to stick on the cover as an example of Monster Hunter's classic brand of creature design to draw people in and show them the kind of thing that they can expect inside. But I've never just been a really big fan of Nargacuga as a monster properly, and I know that upsets some people greatly, but I don't dislike Nargacuga, I just don't think it's quite as good as the things that I have ranked in higher tiers. Moving on then, we've got Legiacrus in the A tier, starting off our journey into 3rd generation as the flagship of Monster Hunter Tri. This monster is pretty iconic, and generally speaking, this is one of the Monster Hunter games that really took off getting new people in to try it more than previous entries, and that can at least partially be credited to Legiacrus being on the cover and pulling people in. And and Legiacrus was also the start of a theme that started from this point where the flagship usually embodied some of the main mechanics of the game that they are attached to. Legiacrus being a specific example of a monster that fights underwater but also can fight on land, with Monster Hunter Tri and the 3rd gen in general as a whole being all about underwater combat, and even just with that, he is a great example of what the term flagship can mean in my eyes. As a monster, I do think that he's great as well. I just really hope that we get to actually have him return to the main series one day. I may not be his biggest fan personally, but he's a beloved monster, and it's been way too long, given that he's one of only a couple of monsters on this list that haven't been redone in the 5th or 6th generation so far. Following that, we've got Zinogre, also in the A tier, as the flagship of Monster Hunter Portable 3rd. This game actually lost underwater combat, and so it's fitting that its flagship is something incredibly landlocked, as a Zinogre in a pond would probably go similarly well to a toaster in a bathtub. He was, however, the first monster of a whole new type, being the first fanged wyvern, and the only fanged wyvern in the series until 5th generation monsters were added in and that category was expanded. He's generally just a very cool monster. He is quite spiky for my liking, but all of his spikes exist for ecologically sound reasons, as it houses the bugs that give him his electric charge. Generally speaking, I think Zinogre fits a similarly fitting state of flagship as things like Tigrex and Nargacuga. I just like him a little bit more as an actual monster, personally. Then we have Brachydios in the S tier as the flagship for Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. He introduced the blast status to the series, and it was even just known as Slime originally because that was the only source of it. He was super unique, and he still is, really. His fighting style is totally unlike any other monster, and he is not only extremely special, one of a kind within the series, but he's also a really fun monster in general as well. Fantastic flagship, lots of importance within the game mechanically speaking as the father of a new status, and just as a great monster in general, an easy S tier in my opinion. Then moving on to 4th gen, the flagship of Monster Hunter 4 was Gore Magala, who I have in the A tier. Fantastic flagship for flagship purposes, tons of mystery, and the fact that he's one of the most popular monsters in general says all that it really needs to about how good he is at drawing people in to try Monster Hunter. On top of that, he's the cause of the frenzy virus, which is an incredibly important mechanical part of Monster Hunter 4, and he is deeply tied to the story of that game as well, so he embodies the title of flagship monster very well. The only reason that he isn't in a higher tier is that I just like the monsters that are up in higher tiers more than I like Gore Magala. He gets full marks for flagshipiness, but not quite full marks for just my feelings on him personally compared to the other monsters. Next up is Sergios as the flagship of Monster Hunter 4U, who I have in the S tier, and I know it's probably heresy to some people that I have him above Gore Magala, but hear me out. He may not be as deeply tied to the fabric of the game as Gore Magala is, but similar to Brachydios in the 3rd gen, he introduced a new status to the series, being the first monster with Bleed. This is slightly less impactful as Bleed hasn't been used a crazy amount since then, nor do hunters get access to Bleed to be able to apply it to monsters, but it still is a pretty big deal to have a whole new thing added in. He's also intended to be the fastest flying wyvern, or at least he was at the time of his addition, and generally speaking he has just grown on me a lot since he was brought back in Sunbreak, and we'd had the updated version of him there too, mostly because his visuals were just so much cleaner and more defined, and I just really found I could appreciate his beauty a lot more as a result than I was able to in the 4th gen. Next up we have Glavenus, the main box art flagship for Monster Hunter Generations, and a member of the Fated Four, which the developers stated that they view all 4 of as the flagships. I have this monster in the B tier. I've always said this, but I find Glavenus to be a bit over-designed as a creature, and I say that as someone who thinks acidic Glavenus, his subspecies, completely sort of fixes that by just being a lot more natural and fitting to its habitat, to its environment, whereas Glavenus has a very unnatural looking shell. It doesn't really fit aesthetically where it lives. It has a tail that's just a straight up sword. Like, it's not a sharp body part it uses like a sword, but it is just a full-on blade as its tail. It uses that to start fires, and in so many ways, honestly, I feel like Quemetris being put into Monster Hunter Wilds is really funny because he is, to me, a lot of the same concepts as Glavenus, a lot of the same ideas, but just done in a much more toned down manner. They're even both brute wyverns with similar color schemes. All in all, I do like Glavenus as a monster. I think he's an alright flagship, but there are monsters I prefer even among the ones he shares flagship status with within his own game. So this tier feels correct for him. Speaking of which, we have Astalos in the A tier as another member of the Fated Four that helmed the same game. I simply just like Astalos more as a monster. I think all of the Fated Four are memorable for their own reasons, and all fill a similarly strong position as a flagship in my eyes, so their placement relative to each other is mostly just my thoughts on them as a creature in general, and Astalos is definitely a pretty good one in my eyes. After that, we've got Gammoth in the B tier, and this one I still find pretty disappointing. This is the other main monster that has not gotten redone and re-released again in the modern Monster Hunter games, and I really hope that they do give her another chance at some point sooner rather than later, because Gammoth is one of those monsters that I find unbelievably cool and interesting as a creature and as a design for a monster. Visually and conceptually, she's awesome, but the fight just lets her down completely. It's too slow, it's not particularly fun to engage with because you can have slow fights that are also fun. I just don't find her fight all that fun. She is carried to the B tier entirely on design quality, and if she came back with an improved fight at some point, she could easily go up a tier or even two for me. Then to finish off the Fated Four, we have Mizetsune, who has always been my favorite of the four. The pink paintbrush bubble fox goes up in the S tier for me personally, and this monster not only has its own unique blight, the bubble blight, giving it some extra specialness compared to the other Fated Four members, but fighting with bubbles in general is such a creative concept, and using the soap to slide around the place is just a really cool monster with an extremely well-made fight as well, especially now that I can consider Soulseer mode to be a part of base Mizetsune with its redone fight in Monster Hunter Wilds now as well. Moving on then to Generations Ultimate, the main flagship was Valstrax, the jet engine dragon, and I have him in the S tier as well. When I first saw Valstrax, I had a bit of that same feeling that I get from Glavenus, where he just feels almost too man-made rather than something that I could somewhat suspend disbelief for and to actually think of as a natural creature, but seeing his actual moveset made me overcome that thinking pretty quickly, and it made me realize in Monster Hunter there is a sort of direct correlation that can be drawn between suspension of disbelief and just how cool a monster is. If a monster is cool, it can be at least a little bit unrealistic and get away with it. The cooler a monster is, the more unrealistic you can make it, and Valstrax is a great example of something that is so stupendously cool that I don't care in the slightest how unnatural he feels. He's just awesome, and that's that. The other technical flagship of Generations Ultimate is Bloodbath Diablos, which I have in the S tier as well. He was chosen as the sort of main leader of the Deviants, and the Deviant monsters were the main endgame mechanic of Generations and Generations Ultimate, and in that sense he fills a flagship role quite well. As a monster, he's one of the best variation monsters I've ever seen, meaning things like subspecies or variants or risen, stuff like that. He's fantastically engaging, great design, well executed combat, and just a really enjoyable experience all around, aside from of course how much pain I feel when he hits me. And with that, we move on to the 5th generation games with Nergigante, the flagship of World, who I have in the S+ tier. He is the absolutely perfect example of a flagship monster for me. His design is completely just iconic. It's intriguing enough to get you to pick up the game when you look at the cover. He's a main fixture of the story, and importantly, he is one of the main things that I think about when I think about Monster Hunter World. He is intrinsically tied to the game, and given that Monster Hunter World was the game that brought the most brand new players into Monster Hunter, you have to give him at least some credit as the flagship for bringing those players in. And as the game that had the most new players, him being one of the most learnable monsters in the series is such a great, perfect fit. The first time that you fight him, he feels really overwhelmingly strange and challenging. The spikes make no sense, and it's tough. The more you fight him, you start to understand that you can stop him from ever doing his strongest move, that you can get loads of free knockdowns from him, and he is just a fight that scales difficulty inversely to your knowledge about him, which is something that I think is really cool when done right, and it makes him a clear S+ flagship monster in this context for me. After that, we have Velkhana in the A tier, the flagship of the Iceborne expansion expansion. My opinions on Velkhana have softened over time, as much as Velkhana's mechanics are to harden, of course. I think she is a great flagship for Iceborne as a game, very deeply tied to everything going on, and I think that her design and her fight are pretty unique and enjoyable as well. My only gripe, really, still that I hold on to this day, is that her beam should not be able to go through her own solid ice walls. But the amount of spite that I carry for that problem has gone down over time, which is why I've got her in the A tier. Moving on, we have Magnamalo in the A tier as well as the flagship of Monster Hunter Rise. Over time, people have convinced me into accepting him as a somewhat realistic monster as far as his actual gases are concerned, and I do like the idea that he basically fights with exploding farts as his main weapon, but I still struggle to get over things like the extendable arm blades. I mean, they're cool and all, but they just make me feel like he's an action figure with the extra features that they would plaster all over the packaging. He's great as a flagship, and he's a solid monster, but A tier is his upper limit for him on my personal list here. Next up is Malzeno as the flagship of the Sunbreak expansion, and I have him in the S tier. He's a fantastic flagship, he is a fantastic monster, he is unbelievably tied to Sunbreak as a game and the story that takes place within it. He's got an extremely cool creature design, and the fight is just really solid. The only reason that I have it in S and not S+, is I think while it ticks pretty much every box that I'm looking for here, it just doesn't tick them quite as hard as Nergigante does, so it feels better to not have him in the same tier. Then there's also another one we have to talk about before we get to Wilds, which is Espinas, who is only added to the main series in Sunbreak, but is technically the flagship of a different Monster Hunter game, being Monster Hunter Frontier. Espinas I've gotten the A tier. I think Espinas does a pretty good job as a flagship, being the flagship for the entirety of Frontier, essentially, and I also think that Espinas is a pretty solid monster. I don't think it's necessarily one of my favorite flagships. I don't think that it's necessarily as intrinsic to Frontier as some of the monsters are on this list to their game of note, but I think it is a very solid A tier inclusion. Finally, today we have our newest addition to the list, the flagship of Monster Hunter Wilds, Arkveld, who I have in the S tier. This means that in the end, we actually only have one S+ tier flagship monster, but Arkveld is an easy S tier to me. I think I'm past recency bias on this one. He is deeply tied to the narrative of Wilds. It pretty much completely centers around him to the point that even the final boss gets overshadowed by the continuing story surrounding Arkveld into high rank. As for my thoughts on him as a monster, he just so perfectly fits the idea of a creature that has been extinct for hundreds of years or longer. He looks ancient, he looks old, he's like a caveman unfrozen from the ice. It just fits great. I love his design in general, I love the way that the story revolves around him, and his fight is super unique as the only main series monster with chainblade appendages coming off of its wings. I think he is an absolutely top tier monster in general, and he is a fantastic flagship. But when talking about flagship comparisons specifically, I do have to give Nergigante his time to shine here, and I think he absolutely deserves to sit alone with the crown in the S+ rank. That just about does it for today then, everyone. My tier list ranking the flagship monsters of the series against each other. Of course, this is all my own opinions and my own thoughts, and it's worth noting that I am, of course, comparing them to each other, ranking them against each other, and so that is the context to take this in. That said, I hope you've enjoyed this ranking, and let me know which flagships are your own favorites down in the comments below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.